Welcome back to the Psychedelic Scene Podcast. I'm your host, Jill Sitnick. Think of me as your psychedelic big sister who's trying to break everything down for you. Today we're talking to Wendy Schoeff, and she is a psychedelic coach just like me, but she focuses on microdosing and ADHD. And as someone who is kind of a novice to the ADHD world, not a novice to the microdosing world, but definitely a novice to the ADHD world, she broke things down for me so that I could understand kind of the system dysregulation that's happening. And throughout the interview, to me, she sounds like the adult in the room who's talking about microdosing in a very practical way. The very same steps that go into a macro journey, she describes those steps in terms of microdosing very specifically for ADHD goals. So family, I think you're going to enjoy this one. Let's go ahead. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Psychedelic Scene Podcast. I'm your host, Jill Sitnick, and I'm looking forward to learning a whole bunch today. I know out and about in the psychedelic cultural scene, we all hear the term microdosing, but I think it's important to kind of filter a little bit and talk about microdosing in specific contexts. And our guest today, Wendy Perkins Schoeff, is going to be speaking and educating me, because I am a novice with this stuff, about microdosing in terms of ADHD. And she's already warned me that whatever questions I have, I'm allowed to ask. So who knows exactly where this conversation is going to go. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here and talk about one of my favorite topics.
Well, so to kick this off, let me let the viewers know who you are. So everybody strap in. This is a pretty cool lady. Wendy Perkins Schoeff is a trauma-informed coach and a researcher who has revolutionized how we understand ADHD and microdosing through her groundbreaking Metabolic Ecology framework. I'm sure we're going to be talking about that, right? With over a decade of experience studying neuroscience, neuroplasticity, and brain development, informed by supporting her son through a brain injury, Wendy challenges the conventional chemical imbalance model of ADHD. And as a researcher with the Mothers of Mushroom Initiative and the creator of the 5-step holistic microdosing with ADHD protocol, her work reframes ADHD as symptoms of a dysregulated system and demonstrates why microdosing success depends on addressing allostatic load and building energetic capacity, not just taking a substance. And I mean, that last sentence, not just taking a substance, is like the pinnacle, I think, of everybody in the psychedelic scene right now, right? It's not just taking the substance. So, Wendy, introduce yourself to our listeners. What's your origin story? How do you find yourself talking to, the Psychedelic Scene Podcast?
All right. Where do I begin? I was born. No. Like many people, I had careers before careers and careers after careers. I myself have ADHD, so I definitely bounced around a lot. But I definitely follow my interest. And long story short, for back maybe about 7-8 years ago, I started becoming an orgasm and neuropleasure coach. I was separated from my ex, went on my own sexual exploration, started learning new things, tried to find the information, and decided to just share it with the world. But also simultaneously, I have my son who's 13, who was born with a brain injury. So I have an older son too. But that really informed a lot of my perspective on some of the things I would read scientifically, because I learned a lot about how sometimes the books don't always match reality and what they say will work doesn't always work. And then sometimes things that shouldn't work do work. So I kind of have always approached all of this together from a very beginner's mind, but also knowing that I actually grew up in a family of engineers. So I'm very science oriented and trying to figure things out. And so I had a client, one of my orgasm clients, who's a nurse, and she had questions about microdosing, but she couldn't go to anyone in her field because of fear of losing her job. And so she asked me, and I was like, I don't really know anything about it. And she's like, I'm not worried. You're going to start researching and you'll get me the answers. And I basically haven't stopped researching since. And so that's how I got here.
Well, I like the learner's mindset. I started my career back when the dinosaurs roamed as a teacher, and so the idea of constantly being curious and learning, I think that kind of applies to all of us in this space. All right, so please help level set. I am a novice when it comes to ADHD. Can you give us, I don't know even what to say, the definition or the symptoms? Give us how you explain ADHD to folks.
Okay, so if someone's listening to this, they probably either have ADHD or know someone has ADHD and are curious about it and maybe have a beginning kind of knowledge of it. So the way people always say kind of describe it is someone who can't stay focused, lacks attention. That's why it's called attention deficit. And the H stands for hyperactivity, but that hyperactivity can show up in different ways. And then they follow it up with disorder. And the way our current model is with what we call mental illnesses, and I'm saying that in quotes because the mind is not separate from the body. They use your own perception of your reality to ask you questions. Like they'll ask you questions and you explain to the person in front of you what you're experiencing. And then that person, the psychologist or psychiatrist, whoever's doing the intake, hears your answers and then determines based on your self-prescribed symptoms what your diagnosis is. And so there's quite a few things that are wrong with that whole process. It requires an understanding of how to interpret the symptoms, and it also requires someone to actually be able to accurately describe what their internal experiences are. And I think a lot of this is informed a lot by my son because he can't speak and communicate like you and I do. And I can only use his biology and how things are kind of showing up, like his behavior. And I can only work with like physical things, like cues to be able to figure out, because I can't ask him, well, what are you feeling right now? And it kind of started triggering some ideas of like, why do we do this for ADHD? And then remember orgasm, neuropleasure, all orgasms start and end in the brain. So that's all the nervous system. So in order to get a deep understanding of that, I was really diving into the nervous system. Obviously with someone with a brain injury, I was really diving deep into the nervous system. Having a child, I was interested in behavior and how that presents. And that really kind of brought me to this understanding of trauma and stress and how it all relates. And what I started seeing very clearly is that ADHD really is a classification of symptoms from someone who has a dysregulated nervous system. And so at the end of the day, it's still a diagnosis is still just saying that you have symptoms. And I think most people can understand this through sadness. There are people who, everyone experiences sadness. Everyone's experienced inattention. Everyone experiences lack of focus. Everyone experiences anxiety. Everyone experiences all the things. But when someone is so depressed that they can't get out of bed and function, they know that there's a problem. They know that they're not like other people. They can see clearly, this is a struggle for me. And it's the same with ADHD. So it's not to say that other people don't have ADHD symptoms, because they're symptoms, but when it becomes so much that you know that I am really struggling with these particular symptoms that are classified as ADHD. That's usually when people will go and try to find help and find a diagnosis or somewhere they want to improve their life. And so hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Well, I get the feeling, give me some feedback on this interpretation. From my trauma background, I can become incredibly dysregulated when I sense a problem. If there's a problem, I go into hyperactivity mode, and I've become very aware of that trigger and that behavior. And I also know I can get back down to baseline. I'm going to assume that the struggle with ADHD in the variety of symptoms you mentioned is that the challenge is getting back down to baseline.
Yes.
How'd I do?
That is a beautiful way to describe it. I might use that later on. I really appreciate it. That's exactly it. It's the same with the sadness. Like everyone experiences sadness, but then they come out of it, they get up, they go to work, they function in life, and then other people struggle and they need to go get support and help. And that is the same with ADHD. We know when you have it that you don't think like other people, because you hear other people talking about things. Like one of the examples, I'll share this because I think it's a fun example. My best friend who does not have ADHD at all. We were talking about taking supplements. I'm like, I forget. She's like, just go put your supplements like in the bottle inside your coffee cup. I was like, I'll just take the supplements out of the coffee cup and make my coffee. She's like, why won't you take your supplements? I don't know. That's the whole, if I knew, I would just take the supplement.
That's a great example. Okay, that's a great example. I know what baseline is. For some reason, I'm not getting there. Okay, yeah. Baseline is I should take my supplements. I'm not getting there. Okay, yeah. All right. So we established ADHD as a baseline. We gave that definition. Thank you so much for your kindness for helping me understand that. I'm pretty sure most of our audience knows what microdosing is, but for that one listener who's brand new, can you give us a definition of microdosing from your perspective?
Actually, I'm glad that we're describing microdosing because even though people have heard it, this is one thing I learned on the Mothers of the Mushroom Project. People have very different dose ranges for microdosing. So by definition, micro means small, or if you want to get really technical, it's like 1,000th, I think. When you're talking about LSD, that makes sense, but other substances, micro just means really small. In general, now the consensus is it's about 1/10 or so of what someone would call a full dose. Now that starts getting really complicated because the different substances have different dosing. So basically, what has started to become part of the nomenclature is that microdosing is this word called subperceptual. It's not exactly the right word. The better word would be subthreshold. But if you don't know what that means, it doesn't make sense to say, because people can understand subperceptual, so it kind of clicks for people. But I'll explain subthreshold since we're here on the podcast and I can. Threshold is like a doorway. That's, the jam at the bottom of the door when you cross from one room to the other. That's called the threshold. And you can think of it as when you're taking a large dose that you go through that door into another place. Threshold is at that door where you're still on this side of the doorway. And then microdosing is actually below that. So you can't really even see the other side of the door. Now, a lot of people in the psychedelic space, they're like, well, I don't feel anything. Like, yeah, that's the whole point. And a lot of times people will be like, well, I tried a lower dose, but I didn't feel anything. But then I took a little bit bigger and then I felt something. So that's a good microdose for me. Technically, that's not a microdose if you're feeling it. And that, I think, is a very difficult thing for people because so many people just want to know it's working. And the whole microdosing process is a process of developing trust with yourself. And that is partly why it's very interesting to people and also elusive to a lot of people.
So I have a lot of friends who are not in the psychedelic space. And one of the ways I described it was that, how you have to, as a woman, how you have to take your vitamin D. Most women, especially my age, we have to take our vitamin D. Do we have a clue whether it's working or not? Probably not until we get our blood tests, but we also know that we're a little perkier, we're a little cheerier. Cloudy days aren't as awful, but because it's such a long, subtle kind of thing, you don't take your 2 vitamin D capsules and like suddenly, life is amazing. It's kind of over time that you realize the winter blues haven't hit you that hard. And so when I kind of reframed it like that, one of my friends was like, oh, okay. But I do love the definition of threshold, especially for people who are experienced with psychedelics, because they know what that threshold is. And I think it also would help for people who are trying to find like the correct microdosing dosage. And I personally feel it's an individual body dosage depending upon your own personal threshold.
Yes. That's actually the whole metabolic ecology concept, is that understanding that from one moment to the next, you're going to be a different person and you're going to have different needs. And one of the easiest analogy that I use to explain this, I have a kid, as I said. So let's say he spills his milk. One day he spills his milk and I'm like, that's okay, honey. Here, let's go over. Let's get the towel. Let me show you how to wipe up the milk. The next day he spills the milk and I'm like, oh my God, what are you doing? Why aren't you paying attention? There was nothing different about what he did. It's literally the same exact thing. So why am I responding differently from the same exact situation? Because it's not the same exact situation inside my body. So everything that's going on in my personal ecology, my metabolic ecology, is different from one moment to the next. And so without that understanding, you kind of start grasping for things that maybe are not the right thing for you in the moment. Which also really goes in kind of in the face of traditional medicine. They say, take this at this time, at this day, with this amount. And it's very consistent and exactly the same. And, what you start to realize when you're looking at, medicine development is that they basically, that'll work for 60% or more of the population. And then you cross your fingers and hope that you're the 60%. Versus when you take a more personal approach and looking at your whole person, you can actually get the right microdosing protocol for that person. And it usually shifts and change because my framework is goal, setting, intention. And then you start looking at what I call dosing, which is both the substance and, the protocol around it, and those amount and quantity and all that. Because it's going to be different, because all the medicines do different things. Just like setting, for example, if your setting is at night versus in the morning, are you going to drink a cup of coffee at night, or are you going to drink a cup of coffee in the morning? That setting is really important to understand because the medicines do different things. And so we instinctively do this in our life with everything, except for when it comes to medicine. We kind of give away our own autonomy over what is our personal experiences and expect someone else to kind of fix us for us by giving us a magic pill.
Someone who potentially has never met us and just put instructions on the side of a bottle, per se.
Yep, exactly.
And I think it's really important to point out the umbrella term psychedelics. There are different psychedelics, folks, and I'm pretty sure our listeners are sophisticated enough to realize, but for the newbies out there, just because it is labeled a psychedelic does not mean it's going to act the same as every single psychedelic. The analogy I give is you can't go to a pharmacist and just kind of point randomly to any of the medicines because they are prescription medicines and just say, give me one. They all have different purposes. I mean, a psychedelic can certainly lead you to an enhanced state, but they will do it differently and have different reactions and different responses. And I love what you just said in terms of setting. Some of them you definitely don't want to take at night if you want to get any sleep.
Exactly. And even with a microdose too, some microdoses are very long, just medicine, food, all the things that we take in, whether it's lotion. Like, haven't you ever put lotion on your hands and it like disappears and your hands are dry a minute later? And then there's others where you're like, oh, wow, that lasted a really long time, right? Everything is so unique. And, even if you take, say, like the mint family of plants, right? They're still all mint family. They're still very much connected. They're similar, but there's a big difference between rosemary and peppermint. Like, they're very different, or Mexican sage. Those are all in the mint family. So psychedelics is just a broad term for just saying something that is basically, and at this point, I think it's more anything that's psychoactive that changes your kind of outlook. I'll just leave it briefly like that in some way, right? So, which is, I don't know, we have all kinds of psychedelics that we experience every day. It's just not in the form of a substance.
Agreed. That could be a whole other podcast episode, right? Of all the different enhanced states. Yeah. All right. So because I'm a newbie in this space, this is kind of like my prime question. You ready? All right. What's the biggest misconception people have about microdosing for ADHD? And so what do you wish that they would know instead?
Ooh. So remember how I said
go slow. Go slow. I'm a newbie.
So remember how I said ADHD is a bunch of symptoms? Well, those symptoms are different for different people. So if you know anyone going through perimenopause, they will tell you there's like over 100 different menopausal symptoms, right?
Right.
It's the same for ADHD. One person with ADHD may struggle with organization and keeping their home clean. Another person may be a clean freak. They still both have ADHD. It just shows up in different ways. So this is where, number one, it's about thinking about your goal. That's why I always start with goal first, because when your struggles are different, if you're good about taking your supplements in the morning, but you are completely anxious about every single appointment and you're showing up an hour and a half early because you're worried that you're going to forget because time is just one of those things that leaves your brain. They're very different. Like those are completely different goals. So the medicine, you can't even kind of think about the medicine until you figure out what the goal is. And then set is that whole metabolic ecology. What's your sleep like? What's your, nutrition like? What is going on physically with your body? I like to look at physical, mental, spiritual, social, and emotional health and those kind of components to look at what's going on with your set. Because if you have a great relationship that's supportive and you've got a good job that you're not worried about, it's different than when you're in an abusive relationship and you're worried about where your rent money is coming from. Like you just cannot ignore those and you have to take those into consideration and figuring out kind of, okay, what really is the most important goal? What's realistic with my set? Also, what's my setting? I, as a mom, especially, now I'm more familiar with all the different tools available. I have lots of plant allies that I rely on, psychedelic or not. And I know when they work for me and at different times. But when I'm trying something for the first time, I'm not going to want to do that with my kids around because I want to develop a relationship with it myself and figure out, okay, how does this work with me when I'm not being responsible? So and understand that things are going to come up. And because when you're talking about also with ADHD, now medically, they have shown that people with ADHD have low dopamine, low norepinephrine, oftentimes low serotonin. These are neurotransmitters that do different things in your body. And the medicines, the plant medicines, they trigger different systems to do different things. And you can't just like a pharmacy, you just don't go in and be like, hey, I need focus. I want the one that fits over on the shelf. You're like, okay, no. Okay, let's see. What does this medicine do? How is that going to work in your body? And it's no different for psychedelics. And I think that especially when people are looking at microdosing, it's because they're looking usually to improve their life, and that's going to be very focused on their setting. It's not necessarily trying to get your labs down, not to say that that's not a feature of it, but it's really more about your setting and like how and that's where your intention now comes in. It's like, what's your intention? Like, what are you trying to be a better mom? Are you trying to, stay, more focused at work? Are you trying, what is your goal? And then your attention completely changes based on your goal. Like, how are you showing up? Like, what are the things that you want to work on to kind of achieve that goal? Because you can't even set your intention until you know what your goal is. So that's why you can see how all that stuff comes first beforehand. And the reason why this is specific to ADHD is because we are already under stress. And so there are certain substances that actually increase different kinds of stress. And so do you want to go for the substance that's actually going to exasperate the thing that you're already trying to work with? Or do you want one that's going to be complementary to what you're struggling with?
I think what I heard was that people want the magic pill to just fix the ADHD. And what you're saying, which is very much in the psychedelic realm of wait. We have to be a little bit more self-aware and focus a bit in terms of what's a specific goal. Let's set an intention and let's make sure that's an achievable goal. Because if your environment is not conducive to that goal being accomplished, we might need to rethink it.
Yeah. I mean, that's very accurate to what you said right there. Obviously, it's gonna be a little nuance for everybody, but yes, that's in general, that's true.
It's one of the things I've said before about some of the psychedelic research about different populations, and that psychedelics don't work for certain populations. And one of the things I've said is, wait a minute, let's look at the environment that different populations go back to. It's one thing to be in a room in a safe place, and it's another thing to go back to an environment that isn't safe versus somebody who is going to an environment that is safe. The measurement in terms of success is just not going to be there with those two different environments. And explaining that, and people who haven't been through a psychedelic experience or understanding integration don't realize that. And I'm like, well, think about wet paint. Is wet paint going to dry well in a violent situation with people being smacked against a wall? Versus wet paint going to be drying well in a nice calm environment where people are just able to leave and exist. And they're like, oh yeah, setting is important.
Yes, it's hugely important. Yeah, and it's the same for microdosing. And the thing that I know, there's something called the dose response curve, which I'm not going to get into the science of that, but the mechanisms of action are the same regardless if there's a little amount or a large amount. So
how it works is the same in terms of okay.
Yeah. So yeah, mechanisms of action. Sorry. That's the common term. So maybe you're not getting, I like to think about microdosing as a kind of a nudge versus a push. So most of the time in medicine or like large macrodoses, journeys, most of the things that, if you're of my age, when you heard about psychedelics, where the trees are talking to you and you're seeing bright colors and all that, that's like the journey. Microdosing, as we said, is that sub-perceptual, sub-threshold kind of level. And so because you're not seeing anything, it doesn't mean it's not still doing something. It's just very subtle, and that without your intention. So actually, I'm going to use another analogy. Okay, so I like this analogy about a plane. So when you take a psychedelic, it's like you turn the plane engines on, and a microdose is just going to be like taxiing along the runway. So have you ever seen a plane? It actually goes like pretty fast, and it's pretty substantial. And so now, like, there's some movement there. And if you take a large amount, there's going to be a takeoff, and you're going to get into a different elevation. It's going to be a whole different experience. And then there's also turbulence area. And if you don't get the right amount, you can end up in turbulence, and where you're trying to lift off, but you can't get up into the air, and it feels very uncomfortable. And so with microdosing, just starting with a substance and this amount, I need to feel something. Sometimes when you feel something, you're actually just putting yourself into turbulence. You're not actually getting the benefit of a microdosing, because the microdosing is like the taxiing. Then your intention kind of shows the plane which way to go.
Hmm.
Without the
Hmm.
intention, it doesn't mean that the plane won't be moving. It's definitely going to be moving, but the intention is going to kind of show the plane, this is where we want to go. And you can still get benefit without an intention. It's very clear in the work that I've been doing with people that when you have intention, that plane moves in the direction that you want it to versus haphazardly. That may or may not be what you want.
I'm going to tell you right now, I am totally going to be using that analogy moving forward. That is fantastic. Yes. All right. So then thinking about that plane, thinking about the different, I'm going to use the word levels because I'm not a pilot. I guarantee there's better words than the different levels. If someone hasn't addressed their nervous system and they're suddenly going, right up to that second level, like there's obviously going to be an issue. What happens if someone is going to start trying to microdose, but they have their system is just completely dysregulated?
So we're talking ADHD here, which makes it a little bit easier versus the general population. So I am speaking specifically to ADHD at this moment. So
Okay.
if you don't have ADHD and you're listening and you're like, that's not my experience, that's why. If you have ADHD, it's going to, because of the nervous system being dysregulated for so long, people usually fall into these two categories. I look at stress responses from flight. It starts with flight. If you look at the biology, I separate biology from behavior. So I use a little bit different terminology than what people commonly hear because a lot of the terminology was set up by psychologists who look at behavior. And I'm looking at biology, but I try to use the words that match as much as possible. So the biology is flight, then fight, then freeze, and then flop. Behavior is fix, fight, fawn, and then dissociate. So the reason, because they match the biology. So when someone has ADHD, they're not really hanging out in that flight response very much because their energy is depleted. So they will move to fight, freeze, and flop. Most people who are hanging out and fight a lot are not actively seeking for help because it's by the very nature of that biological response. You're protective, you're in a bubble, and all your problems are outside of you. And so you're more about blaming and you're less about trying to fix things. Now, maybe when they move into that, get some energy, they'll move into flight and they'll try to fix. But most of the time when people are coming to me, and so maybe, I only have the people that I've worked with and maybe it's the people that I draw in. So not saying this is everyone, but at least in my experience with the people I work with, most people are very practiced that I work with being in that freeze response or the flop response. And the freeze response is feeling overwhelmed, where you're looking at your stress, like you're facing your stress, but you can't figure out what to do. And you're like, can someone just please tell me what to do? Like, can someone just fix this for me? Like, I can't figure this out. I don't know what to do. It's a lot of kind of helplessness and overwhelm is very much the feeling of being in freeze. Flop is when you dissociate and you're like, I'll just deal with that later. I've never met a lazy person yet. I've met people who do a lot of productive procrastination sometimes, but they're not lazy by any means. Like I seriously have never come across a lazy person. I've come across people who don't have enough energy for the task at hand at that moment, but that's not lazy. That's your biology saying, I don't have energy right now. And when you start looking at that, when you start identifying, and so people who are in flop and kind of dissociating and busy doing things like they've got a big project, for example, because remember ADHD. So they got a big project and they start cleaning their kitchen. That's productive procrastination. They're doing something productive, but they're actually procrastinating on the task at hand. That's a form of flop. It's because they don't have enough energy to face their stress. And so they're doing something else that still makes them feel good. This is why sometimes people will be like, I tried microdosing, didn't work. And
Yeah.
so far, the two substances where people say that they're either psilocybin or LSD. And then when I talk to them about, okay, what were you like, what's your set? What's your set? And I kind of run through it. I'm like, oh, of course that did not work for you. That, like, to me, I'm like, oh my God, there's always a reason. So, for example, with psilocybin, it kind of works with that. I call it emotional energy. By the way, all these words, I have the science behind it. It's just a little complicated. So I like to use easier words that people can identify with. Um, but I can explain it all scientifically if anyone wants. But anyway, so psilocybin kind of works with emotional energy. So it's going to basically loosen up your fascia so you can feel your emotions. If your setting is requiring you to stay calm, sit still, maybe, be present for someone else to unload on them, and you took a microdose that's trying to have you feel your feelings, that's the exact opposite of what you need for that setting. LSD is really good. It's a non-specific amplifier. So what LSD is really good is when something gets your attention, it will help you stay with it. Now, if you're already avoiding your work and you are now like, oh, I'm going to organize, because this happened to one of my clients. It's one of my favorite examples.
I see where this is going. Okay.
Yeah. She had a big project and she's like, all right, I'm going to do that. She takes her LSD. She's like, no, I'm going to try it. By the way, I don't provide substances for anybody. So It's just, I'm providing like harm reduction, help support. And she's like, no, I really want to. I'm like, okay, let's see if we can work this out, because, I know what I know, but I don't know what it's like to be in her body. That's what, I always remember beginner's mind. Like, I will never assume anything about anyone's experience. Right. So she takes her microdose, and she goes to sit down on her project. She goes to grab something she needs for the project. And she's like, oh, my file cabinet is disorganized. She ended up creating the most beautiful color-coded filing system and did not do her project, because it got her attention.
It amplified the other thing.
Exactly. So it's really important to understand how the substances work. Once again, you start seeing goal setting intention way before you ever pick the dose and the substance.
I'm going to say, I'm really glad we had this conversation. I feel like you're the adult in the room when it comes to microdosing, because the term just gets thrown around, and I think it's becoming like the aspirin of psychedelics. Oh, just kind of start microdosing. And it's really just not that easy in any way, shape, or form. So I want to thank you for being the adult in the room and saying, no, you got to actually put some thought behind this, and dare I say, some strategy.
It makes me sad to learn that people struggle with it because they don't have to. So Mothers of the Mushroom Project. So for those who don't know, it's a survey. Over 400 mothers responded on the survey about their relationship with mushrooms. And so everything from microdosing to macrodosing, journeys before pregnancy, during pregnancy, after pregnancy, like all the questions were asked. And when we were going through the research, combing through the research over and over. And by the way, when you read over 400 people's experiences over and over again to, synthesize it, it's very powerful to see how beautiful and assistant the mushrooms were for these women in general, like vastly. However, some people did struggle with it. And when you looked at the physical symptoms of it, it's all a matter of like getting the right dose for the person. That's a matter of just having the right support. Like there wasn't anything that was like super harmful or whatever. It was, and not to say that this, this is only 400, that responded. But it would, just off the experience I have, I'm reading it. I'm like, oh my God, if they had had support, this wouldn't have happened. And then stigma was huge. If they hadn't been illegal and they could have gotten support, this wouldn't have happened. And you could see this kind of pattern that every problem that someone struggled with all had to do with the fact that they're illegal. And because they're illegal, the education and support is not there.
Oh, 1,000%. Just the conversation around dosage, around psychedelics in general. There could be so much harm reduction if people could just literally Google without having to go through 20 Reddit feeds and things of that sort.
Yep.
All right. Wendy, my favorite question. I love this question. What's the question I haven't asked you that I should?
Ooh. If someone has ADHD and they're interested in microdosing, what's the first thing they should look at? And I would say sleep. And I know that we hear it all the time, but there's a reason why sleep and ADHD, like troubles with sleep and ADHD, go hand in hand. Because for the most part, anyone with ADHD will say they have problems with sleep, or they're like, "Oh no, I have no problem. My head hits the pillow and I fall asleep immediately." It's like, nope, that's also a problem. So when you start looking at your sleep, finding then the solutions to help you sleep really helps open up a platform first to then playing with some of the other substances. Because if you're going to use, say, like I'm going to throw out some names here of different substances. I'm not, where they're illegal or illegal. That's, depending on where you live too.
Right.
LSD is very long lasting. Wachuma is one that's microdosed, and that's super long lasting too. Those really interfere with your sleep. So if you're already struggling with sleep, they're going to have that. If the psilocybin, your goal set setting, as we talked about, like emotions, if you're bringing up emotions and you can't process emotions, and then you're struggling with sleep, you're still not going to be processing your emotions. So sleep really is kind of the first place to go to. And there's so many ways to get support with that. And there actually even are some plant substances and herbal remedies and different things that really can help people figure that out. And because once you figure that out, then the microdosing really supports that. And, there's other parts of it too, but I would start with sleep. Because once you start sleeping better, you make better decisions. You remember your supplements. You remember to drink your water. You remember all the simple things that you struggle with.
You know what? I just have to say kudos. I really wish I had asked that question because sleep is everything. As someone who has been going through this whole perimenopause, menopause transition, and I think I went 6 months without getting a solid night's sleep and was kind of a zombie, and then started actually getting sleep with my own hormone therapy thing. I was like, oh my gosh, sleep really is the solution for so much, that it really does have to be the baseline. And kudos again for you being the adult in the room, not saying medicine is the first step, saying, hey, no, basic biology, sleep is the first step. So kudos. All right, Wendy, I guarantee you have sparked a ton of interest from folks. So where can folks find you? And you actually have a really cool white paper. So where can people find all that stuff?
At thesuccessdoula.com, and they can find all of the information there. I also have a Substack. So if you like the science part a little bit broken down, if you go to successdoula.com and click on blog, that will take you to my Substack. And so those are kind of the two places. And then I'm on all the socials as well.
All right. Well, we'll make sure that we have all of that stuff. And I'm going to be signing up for the white paper now, because now I have a basic idea of what I'll be reading about. So that's very, very cool. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right, Wendy, super informative. And I'll probably be asking you to come back to talk about some other microdosing topics in the future. This was incredibly enlightening for me and for our listeners. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on here. It was an honor.
So that was fabulous. I am absolutely thrilled with Wendy's explanations. I am totally going to steal some of her analogies, that whole plane taking off and hitting turbulence if your dosage is not quite right or your setting isn't quite right. That is fabulous. Go check out the rest of her information. We'll have it all in the show notes. If you know anybody with ADHD who is struggling, I think just in general, she's got a lot of information, even if you're not interested in the microdosing part. And as always, if you like this content, head on over to Psychedelic Scene .com. That's where Jason, our founder, has a ton of content about psychedelic culture. And if you like this content, think about buying him a little cup of coffee to keep him steeped in caffeine so he can keep the lights on, because this is a labor of love. And until next time, take care.